in the town square there, where everything was pristine and clean, and then they wore it down and shot all the 80s stuff. And for this movie, when they decided to go back to the pristine 1950s look, they had to recreate it, and it was actually more expensive for them to rebuild it and restore it than it was to build it from scratch. So it's just an interesting quirk of production. It's harder to restore something, right, than it is just to build it from scratch. And they're jumping all around, the future, the past, the present here. So there's a lot of changes to the town square of Hill Valley there. And a nice attention to the detail, speaking of that, if you look closely, the ledge on the clock tower that Doc broke in 1955 is still broken in 2015, which is great. I did not even realize that was a thing until I was doing research for these movies and rewatching. And you can see how his feet slip there and it breaks off, and that's there the rest of the movie. So again, there's a little attention to the detail, which I like quite a bit.
I don't know why they didn't just go back in time and film in the 50s. I mean, they had the DeLorean there with them.
Brandon, we'll talk off microphone about that. But
okay.
Now, I did not catch this, but the 1985 Doc Brown, when he's in 1955, he's dressed in that like coat and hat, and he has that interaction with his 1950s self, which clearly 1950s Doc and 1955 Doc should have been able to tell that was himself. But if you look closely in the original film, there is a character dressed just like that, walking around in the town square shortly before the clock tower scene. And apparently this wasn't intentional; it just kind of worked out that way. And that's kind of how they were like, "Oh, okay, well let's kind of disguise in that way." So that's a kind of fun way to say, "Oh, they were there the whole time." Although that's not how time travel in Back to the Future works.
Right?
It is a fun Easter egg, because some people are like, "Oh man, that's so cool! Doc and Marty were there the whole time in the first film." And no, that's not the case. That's not how time travel works in this franchise. So
the time travel in this one does not work very well at all.
Yeah, we'll talk. We'll unpack it. Now, there are some deleted scenes of Back to the Future Part 2. I'm not going to go into all of them, but a couple of the major ones were old Biff, right? When he gets out of the DeLorean after changing the past, right? He's like in pain. You see him like falling over, and there's a deleted scene where he disappears, like erased from existence. And the idea was him going back in time and giving himself the younger almanac, made him rich and powerful. But the idea was that Lorraine had killed him sometime in the 90s because he was an abusive, horrible husband, right? And that's why he wouldn't exist in 2015. And I'm not sure exactly why they deleted it. I think because they still leave in the part where he's like, oh, right, like in pain when he's stumbling out. So I guess they really didn't have a way to explain that how would anyone have known that? How could they have explained it in the movie? I guess they couldn't have. But I don't know. I think they should have left it in because it kind of finishes off that little bit where he's like in pain there and disappearing, and you would understand from the first movie what that means. So,
see, I've always interpreted that he was just like having a heart attack and ended up dying as soon as he came back. That's how I've always interpreted it, because like the strain of like getting back to the thing and being old and traveling through time was like too much for his system, and he just had a heart attack and died. Okay.
That's not a bad explanation, right? I mean, that's more than what the movie gives you, so why not, right?
That's my headcanon.
And speaking of Biff getting back, right? Had Doc and Marty just looked at the time display there where it says last time departed, they would know exactly when and where to go. But that's such a big turn of the plot there. Now, another deleted scene involves Dave, Marty's brother, played by Mark McClure. He encounters him in the alternate 1985. And what they decided to do is they decided to delete that scene because they couldn't get Marty's sister back. The actress Winnie Jo Splendor was pregnant at the time. And part of the idea was she would be a prostitute working on the street, right? And that's how, because he's encountering all his family's horrible situations, right? And that was the idea. But Winnie Jo was pregnant at the time, so they couldn't do that. And they're like, well, if we can't include the sister, let's just not include the brother. Let's just drop both of them. Although there is a brief reference to them by Biff in that time period, we don't see them at all. So.
I gotta say that timeline turns a hell of a lot darker if she's a pregnant prostitute on the street.
Now, this is something that I didn't, when I was a kid, I thought it was a different joke. I didn't understand, but when they go to the future, right? And Doc's like, oh, I went to a rejuvenation clinic, and he pulls off his like, old person disguise, and it's Christopher Lloyd again. As a kid, I thought the joke was it didn't do anything, and it's funny. Like, even Marty's like, "Oh, you look great, Doc," because I really couldn't tell a difference, honestly, between old Doc and new Doc. But there is subtle makeup, and if you look at it in the first film and at the beginning of this film, you can see how Christopher Lloyd is in this kind of like old age-ish makeup around his face to give him wrinkles and make him look older. And then the 1955 Doc is Christopher Lloyd at the age he was at the time, which was in his late 40s. So that is why they do that. But I couldn't tell the two apart. And I thought the joke was, oh, it doesn't do anything. Isn't that funny? But it was really, the idea was like, look, we don't want Christopher Lloyd to have to wear this old age makeup, right, for the rest of this movie for no reason. And then also it extends his life, like he says, like 30 or 40 years. And, that plays into the third film where he starts a family and all that. So it all worked out very well. But did you catch that joke when you were younger? Because I didn't.
No, I agree with you. Like, knowing it now, it's a way to get rid of the makeup, because watching Back to the Future again this time, you can really see the old age makeup on him in 1985. So I know why they did it, but yeah, when I was younger, I didn't catch it. I also thought it was like, they didn't really do anything.
Now, when they're in the future, a lot of the cars that you see are from other science fiction films, like Blade Runner or The Last Starfighter. So that they reused props from other films to kind of fill out the talent of new cars, which I think was pretty smart. And also a couple final notes to close this off. Carl Sagan, the famous scientist from Cosmos, and he's an author and well-regarded scientist, right? He considered this the greatest time travel movie ever made. And he praised the accuracy of handling the multiple timelines and what would happen if time travel were possible. So I thought that's high praise coming from Carl Sagan.
This one, part two?
This part two, that's correct.
Carl Sagan knows nothing about science.
Now, finally, the big elephant in the room here is that Crispin Glover does not return as George McFly. And since he didn't return, that is what inspired the whole alternate 1985 plotline with him being dead, with George McFly being dead. Now, there's a lot of debate around, why he didn't come back. According to Bob Gale, Crispin Glover wanted more money and script approval. But according to Crispin Glover, they lowballed him because he had some creative differences with him on the first movie, because he felt like, and this is kind of a valid point. It's Hollywood, it's fantasy, but it's kind of a valid point. Crispin Glover's point was, hey, why are we equating like wealth with happiness, right? Like, oh, their family's fine now because they have a lot of money, right? It's a fairy tale kind of story. I get it, right? So who knows? It's a he said, she said situation. Nobody was there, right? So they recast Crispin Glover with a kind of a look-alike actor. And the big problem, though, was Jeffrey Wiseman, by the way, was his name. The big problem, though, is they used casts of Crispin Glover's face to make Jeffrey Wiseman look like Crispin Glover. They had casts of his face from the first film to kind of make him look older, because all the characters look older. Yeah. And Crispin Glover ended up suing the filmmakers because he did not granted permission to use his likeness in part 2. So he sued them. They settled out of court because they figured they'd be cheaper than going to trial. And because of this, the Screen Actors Guild introduced new rules about the use of actors' likenesses. So that's a whole nother can of worms of what you can use. As I understand it, you can use, like, if they use some clips of Crispin Glover, like from the first film, very limited clips, right? But they use some of that, pictures as well, because those things were produced for the first film. So that's my understanding, that you can use that. But as far as all the new scenes where they tried to play someone off as him, right? Because you recreate moments in the first film, but they're from different angles, and of course, you have Lee Thompson back, right, as Lorraine, so you can use her, but you don't have Crispin Glover back, so they reshoot certain things, and that was where the big thing happened, as well as just blatantly using someone's face molds on top of someone else's face. So that's huge, and that's why you see all these things about likeness rights, and when they recreate actors and CGI these days and all that. So that was actually a huge case in Hollywood. And it's unfortunate because, watching them again this way, like the film is missing something, because, George McFly was kind of the heart of the first movie, I think, and unfortunately Lee Thompson and her character, right, Lorraine, she suffers from Crispin Glover not being there because they don't want him to be there as much, right? The George McFly, because it just draws attention to the fact it's not Crispin Glover. So unfortunately, Lorraine has to kind of take a step back. She still has some to do, but I feel like if Crispin Glover come back and George McFly come back, then Lorraine would have more to do and Lee Thompson would have more to do. So that's my take on that. And it's weird. I didn't realize there's like a trend in 1980s like science fiction fantasy movies where like the father character does not come back for the second movie. It happens in Godfather Part 2. It happens in Superman 2, and then it happens again in Back to the Future Part 2. So there's all this drama around the father characters in these franchises. So there you go, Brandon. There's your trivia for Back to the Future Part 2.
Heavy. I never noticed that about Crispin Glover. I never paid attention. I never realized it wasn't him because he's upside down when we see him, right?
Well, and that's part of the idea. Like, we'll have him behind a screen door, we'll have him upside down, we'll shoot him from another angle, right? And again, this is stuff I didn't realize when you were a kid because they do a really good job. Mm-hmm. Well, it is kind of funny though on some level. Like they go out of their way to hide the fact they recast George McFly, but they're like, oh, here's a different Jennifer, just completely looks nothing like her. But I think again the thinking is if we refilm this scene shot for shot, that'll make it happen. But yeah, it's funny because again, like you as a kid, you just kind of accept this for what it is, and you're not thinking about it. But when you look at it, you're like, oh, they're clearly. Why aren't we seeing George McFly's face in the 50s anymore? So anyway, there you have it.
But also the girlfriend, she's barely in the first movie at all.
Yeah, so, she's what in I guess 3 scenes because they meet up in the town square, and then they're in the school, and then when Marty gets back, from the future. Like it.
So,
but I am glad that they did keep the one shot of the truck parked parallel in the in the garage, which is again the most unbelievable thing in this entire trilogy.
I didn't have any problems with it when I saw it on the second one here. It's all fine. Anyways, why don't we jump into our discussion here? So, the first problem that I've got with this movie is how fast and loose they are with protecting the timeline in this one. Like in the first one, they were very hardcore about like you can't change the timeline, you can't do this, you can't do that. You got to hide, you got to stay covered. And in this one, they're like everywhere they go, somebody's seeing them do time travel stuff or talk about time travel everywhere they go. And like I guess they backed themselves into a corner with Jennifer, but I mean like. If he doesn't need roads, he could go anywhere. Biff, so young Biff, well, not young Biff, mid-age Biff sees
1985
them.
Biff.
1985 Biff sees them, right? And old Biff overhears them, right? And they're just like talking about it all the time. And like even in the past, right? Like the scene where I didn't really like the scene where the two docs interacted.
No, I don't either.
So because
we will see you again sometime in the future. Oh,
yeah,
it's like, come on.
Kind of silly there. And then even at the end, with the Western Union thing, right? Like where he would just be like, oh, leave this here for 70 years until, and go to this spot on 70 years. Like I haven't seen this movie in 20 years. And what I expected to happen was 1950s Doc Brown to drive up there because he would have left a letter somewhere for Doc Brown, like through the family or something.
Oh, that makes sense, Brandon. I get it, but I think the ending of this film is so great that I'm glad they didn't do that because you get the climax of the first film again at this one, and then Doc's so happy, and then Marty comes like, Doc, he's like, no, I just sent you Back to the Future. You did, but I'm back from the future. I mean, it
is a great ending.
That's one of the greatest endings, and like so good because it plays off the end of the first one. But you're right, like logically, that would have made more sense for Doc to like pass it down through his own family or to himself in some way.
Yeah.
There are a lot of contrivances in this film. I think is your point, right? Because Biff overhears that, sees this. Marty buys this and leaves it here. Oh, Biff steals the time machine because he follows him and figures out how to work it. Now, a lot of this is like to make the plot happen, right?
Right.
So in a lesser movie, it would upset me, but I enjoy the journey we go on because of these contrivances, so it doesn't upset me as much.
Right, but when we get to our final ratings, this does definitely affects my rating of this film because when we were discussing the first one, I praised the script, and I said this script is brilliant because everything they set up leads to something there, and here they're making things happen in order to tell the story that they want to tell. So it does detract from me a little bit on this one here, but it is a very fun ride. It is a very fun journey that they do take us on.
And what is your favorite time period they go to here, because they do a lot of things, right? They go into the future, they go into an alternate 1985, and they go into the past of the first movie again. So